My name is Jake. A few years ago, I experienced one of the most terrifying nights of my life. It happened during a late-night layover at a nearly abandoned bus terminal while I was traveling to Indianapolis. At the time, I had no idea that those few hours would be burned into my memory forever. It was past 1 a.m. The terminal was practically empty. A few people sat scattered around, but no one acknowledged each other. Everyone seemed like they were avoiding something. The dim, flickering neon lights cast eerie shadows on the stained ceiling panels. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped rhythmically, echoing in the silence. I was exhausted, but an unshakable unease had settled deep in my gut. I decided to get some coffee from the vending machine, hoping it would keep me awake. I put in my money, pressed the button. Nothing. The machine didn't respond. Annoyed, I gave it a light tap, and that's when I heard it. A whisper. "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down my spine. I turned around quickly, but the space behind me was empty. Just a few feet away, a hunched old man in a hooded coat sat motionless on a bench, staring at me with cold, vacant eyes. "Don't stay here too long, kid," he murmured. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver through me. I told myself he was just a strange old man, probably homeless, maybe even a little senile. But I couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was wrong. I took my coffee, sat down, and pulled out my phone, hoping to distract myself. No signal. The only sounds were the occasional garbled announcements crackling over the broken intercom. Then I saw him. At the far end of the terminal, barely visible in the shadows, a tall figure stood completely still. I hadn't noticed him before. He didn't move. He didn't shift his weight or adjust his posture. He was just standing there, watching. Before I could process what I was seeing, the power cut out. Everything plunged into darkness. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The air felt thick, suffocating. For a few seconds, I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything beyond my own breathing. Then, the lights flickered back on, and the figure, he was gone. I scanned the room, my pulse still racing, but just as I was beginning to convince myself it was nothing, I saw him again, closer, now, only a few rows away, and his face. He didn't have one. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank, empty void. But somehow, I knew. He was looking right at me. A heavy, paralyzing fear pinned me to my seat. I wanted to run, but my body refused to move. It was as if something was holding me there, forcing me to stay. Then everything in the terminal started to change. The walls seemed to stretch and warp, growing impossibly distant and yet crushingly close at the same time. The lights flickered erratically. The voices from the intercom distorted into unsettling whispers, and the other passengers, they weren't moving. They sat frozen in place, as if time had stopped for them. Then, one of them, a young woman, slowly turned her head to look at me. But her face wasn't human anymore. Her mouth stretched far too wide. Her eyes were nothing but deep, black voids. That was it. Survival instinct kicked in. I ran. I bolted toward the exit, my legs heavy, as if I was wading through deep water. Something was following me. I could feel it closing in, an invisible presence at my back. I reached the doors, yanked them open, and stumbled outside. But the second I stepped out, I froze. I was still inside the terminal. Same lights, same benches, same waiting area, and the faceless man, even closer now. That's when I understood. There was no way out. I screamed for help, but my voice was swallowed by the empty space. The terminal stretched on forever, an endless loop with no exit. And the man, he was still coming. I felt an icy breath on my neck, and everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. I was lying on a bench outside the terminal. No faceless man, no frozen passengers, no whispering voices. For a moment, I thought maybe it had all been a dream. But then I reached into my pocket. There was something inside, a small, worn-out bus ticket. Stamped in faded ink were the words, "One way, nowhere." I never went back to that terminal, but even now, sometimes, late at night, I still feel like something is watching me, and I'm afraid that it's still waiting. My name is Mark, and more than anything, I wish I could forget that night. It all started on a road trip with my best friend, Danny. For weeks, we had been driving across the country, stopping at random places, staying in cheap motels, eating at roadside diners. We wanted this to be the trip of our lives. But that night changed everything. We had just left Ohio and were heading toward St. Louis. It was past midnight, and we were both exhausted. When we saw a sign for a 24-hour bus terminal, we decided to stop. A quick break, then we'd be back on the road. Minutes later, we pulled up in front of a massive but eerily empty terminal. The moment we stepped inside, I felt it. Something was off. The air was thick, stale, like a room that hadn't been opened in years. The floor was cracked, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. No announcements, no employees, no passengers. It was dead silent, almost. A few rows ahead, a man sat completely still, his face hidden under a hood. He wasn't reading, wasn't looking at a phone. He wasn't even breathing. Danny muttered as we passed, "Creepy guy." I nodded, but something in my gut was screaming, "Let's not stay too long. Just rest a bit and go." We sat down in the middle of the waiting area. The silence was suffocating. But after a few minutes, I noticed something. It was too quiet. The ventilation had stopped. The vending machines had gone silent. Even outside, there was nothing. No cars, no wind, no distant sirens. It was as if the world had paused, and then the whispers started. At first, they were so faint that I wasn't sure if I was imagining them. But then, they grew louder. It wasn't just one voice, or two. It was dozens, hundreds, speaking over each other in a language I couldn't understand. Some were frantic, others were low and guttural, like flipping through radio stations, all broadcasting at once. I swallowed hard. "Danny, do you hear that?" He turned to me. His face was pale. He heard it too. The whispers grew frantic, faster, more desperate. Then the lights flickered, and the hooded man moved, but not like a normal person. No shifting, no adjusting, no hesitation. His head simply snapped toward us. His body never moved. Then he stood up. Danny grabbed my wrist. "Mark, his feet." I looked down, and my blood ran cold. He had no feet. There was a gap between him and the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was he was gliding toward us, and the lights went out. Pure blackness. A silence so heavy it crushed my ears. Then the screams. Not human, not natural. Something primal, deep and wrong. The air turned ice cold. My breath felt like frost in my lungs, and then a single light flickered back on, and the hooded man was right in front of us, but he wasn't a man, where his face should have been. There was only a mouth. Not a normal mouth. A gaping, torn, jagged wound, filled with too many razor-sharp teeth. And then he screamed. A sound that burrowed into my skull, shattered reality itself. Danny and I ran, but the terminal wasn't the same anymore. The exit was gone. The chairs had moved. The signs were written in a language I didn't recognize. And worst of all, we weren't alone anymore. From the dark corners of the terminal, more hooded figures emerged. Some had multiple eyes, some had none, and some were nothing but mouths. Danny yanked my arm. "The ticket counter! Run!" That's when I saw it, the only part of the terminal still lit. Behind the glass, a woman sat perfectly still. Danny and I ran up, pounding on the glass. "Please, we need to get out of here." She just smiled, but not like a person. Her smile stretched too far, pulling unnaturally at the corners of her face. Then she reached into a drawer and pulled out 2 old, faded tickets. The words on them were barely readable. "One way, last stop." She leaned forward and whispered, "Your bus is here." That's when I heard it, the doors opening behind me. And there it was, a pitch-black bus. No driver, no lights inside. The hooded figures were already boarding, one by one. And then, something grabbed Danny. He screamed, "Mark, help me!" I grabbed his arm, pulled as hard as I could, but whatever had him was stronger. And then, Danny was gone. Dragged into the blackness of the bus, the doors slammed shut. Silence. And the bus. It didn't drive away. It didn't turn. It simply faded, like it had never been there at all. I went to the police. They checked the security cameras. And here's the part that haunts me the most. The footage showed me. But Danny wasn't there. The entire time I was alone, sitting by myself, talking to no one. But I know the truth. Danny was there. And sometimes, at night, I still hear the whispers calling me. And I know one day they'll come back for me too. I will never forget that night. My mom and I were traveling by bus to visit my grandmother. Flying was too expensive, so the bus seemed like the best option. But if I had known what would happen that night, I would have never stepped into that terminal. It was past midnight when we arrived. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of old leather and something stale. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the empty rows of seats. That was the first thing that struck me. The silence. The terminal was nearly empty. A few passengers sat scattered across the waiting area, but none of them spoke. None of them moved. It was as if they weren't waiting for anything at all, just existing. While my mom checked our tickets at the counter, I glanced around. The large glass windows gave a full view of the outside. And that's when I saw it. Or rather, what I didn't see. There were no buses outside, no cars, no streetlights, nothing. Just emptiness. My mind struggled to process it. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The outside of the terminal led to a void, as if the world had ended right there. A chill ran down my spine. "Mom," I started to say, but before I could finish, the ticket agent spoke. "Your bus is delayed." I turned toward him, and my stomach twisted. When had he gotten there? He hadn't been there a second ago. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, as if his veins were just beneath the surface. But the worst part, his smile was wrong. It stretched too wide, too forced, like his skin was barely holding together. My mom didn't seem to notice. Calmly, she asked, "How long will it be?" The man's eyes snapped to mine. And in that moment, a terrible realization hit me. He knew me. But how? I had never seen him before. He didn't blink as he answered, "It will come His voice was slow, deliberate, as if the words weren't his own, but were being spoken through him. Then he did something that sent ice through my veins. He winked at me, and right then my mom grabbed my hand. Her grip was tight, too tight. I turned to look at her, and that's when my blood ran cold, because my mother, she looked like my mother, but she wasn't. Her eyes were completely black, and she was smiling, the same unnatural, stretched smile. I yanked my hand away, my voice barely a whisper. Who are you?" The thing wearing my mother's face tilted its head, and then the lights went out. The entire terminal plunged into darkness. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then the clicking began. Small, sharp, mechanical clicks. At first, from one direction, then from everywhere. I could feel something moving, but I couldn't see it. Then dim emergency lights flickered on, and in their glow, I saw it. At the far end of the terminal, something was crawling across the floor, but it wasn't human. Its arms were too long, its legs bent at unnatural angles, and its face. It had no face, but I knew it was looking at me. I could feel it. The clicking grew louder, faster. It was moving toward us. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to move. Then my mother spoke, but it wasn't her voice. It was low, distorted, inhuman. "Your boss is here, sweetheart." She turned to me, her black eyes gleaming, but I knew she wasn't my mother. And then a hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed and spun around, and it was my real mom, but her face was full of terror. "Run, now!" I didn't hesitate. We sprinted toward the exit, but the doors were gone. I turned to look outside, and in that moment, I saw the truth. This wasn't a terminal. It never had been. We had been trapped here since the moment we arrived. The walls, the floor, the signs, they were all an illusion. And now, that illusion was breaking. Cracks split across the ground. The terminal itself was unraveling. And then, the clicking returned. But now, it was everywhere. I lifted my head, and I saw them. Dozens of figures. Tall, twisted, faceless, hunched in the corners, clinging to the ceiling, peering from behind the ticket counter, all watching us. The last thing I saw was the faceless creature smiling. But how? It had no mouth. And then everything went black. I woke up outside. The sun was rising. Everything looked normal. But I knew the truth. That night was real. And the worst part, when I turned on my phone, I found a picture in my gallery, a photo of my mom and me, sitting in the terminal. But behind us, there was a faceless figure watching